Why inflation is designed to steal your money. Inflation is often presented as a neutral or inevitable part of modern economies, something to be endured, measured, and occasionally adjusted through policy. But beneath this neutral language lies a quiet transfer of wealth from ordinary people to governments, corporations, and financial institutions. Inflation slowly erodes the purchasing power of your money, diminishing the value of your wages, savings, and long-term investments without requiring direct taxation. Unlike overt theft, it operates subtly, invisibly, and almost universally. Every month, every purchase, every paycheck is affected, and yet most people barely notice because the effects accumulate gradually. Central banks, governments, and financial elites often benefit from this erosion, intentionally or otherwise, as debt becomes easier to manage, assets appreciate, and the balance of economic power shifts. Understanding inflation as a mechanism for quietly redistributing wealth is critical if you want to protect your financial health. It is not merely a number on a report, it is a systemic tool that shapes lives, decisions, and futures. Central banks control the money supply. Central banks wield enormous power over modern economies because they control the supply of money. By increasing or decreasing the amount of currency in circulation, they influence interest rates, liquidity, and general economic activity. On the surface, these actions are framed as tools to stabilize the economy, controlling recessions, encouraging growth, or preventing deflation. However, the ability to create money at will can have hidden consequences for the average citizen. When central banks inject new money into the system, whether through quantitative easing, government bond purchases, or direct lending to financial institutions, the overall supply of currency grows. Unless economic output rises proportionally, the value of each individual unit of currency decreases. Your paycheck, savings, and purchasing power are diluted over time. The very mechanism designed to stimulate the economy is also quietly extracting value from those who hold money rather than assets or debts. The effect is compounded because ordinary citizens are rarely the primary beneficiaries of newly created money. Banks, financial institutions, and large corporations typically access these funds first, enabling them to invest in assets that rise in value with inflation. Meanwhile, those living paycheck to paycheck or relying on cash savings see their wealth eroded passively and almost imperceptibly. Central banks argue that controlled inflation is necessary for economic growth, but the system inherently favors borrowers over savers, institutions over individuals, and governments over citizens. Understanding the role of money supply control is crucial to recognizing how inflation can act as a hidden wealth transfer. Interest rates are manipulated to influence spending. Interest rates are the central bank's primary tool for influencing economic activity. By lowering rates, borrowing becomes cheaper, encouraging consumers and businesses to spend. By raising rates, borrowing costs increase, aiming to cool inflation or slow speculative bubbles. While these tools seem neutral, they have deep implications for wealth distribution. Low interest rates encourage debt accumulation. Governments borrow more cheaply, corporations expand through leveraged financing, and households take on mortgages or loans. Meanwhile, savers earn minimal returns on deposits, unable to keep up with rising prices. The system benefits those who can borrow and invest while punishing those who rely on cash holdings or fixed incomes. Conversely, high interest rates may slow borrowing and spending, but they disproportionately impact lower-income individuals who depend on credit for daily needs. Meanwhile, wealthy investors often profit from higher yields on bonds or other interest-sensitive assets. The manipulation of interest rates is not merely about controlling the economy, it is a mechanism that channels resources and risk unevenly across society. Over time, these policies subtly ensure that money flows toward institutions, governments, and asset holders, while ordinary people experience diminished purchasing power. Interest rate manipulation is a hidden lever of inflationary wealth transfer. Wages lag behind the rising cost of living. One of the most direct ways inflation erodes wealth is by outpacing wage growth. While prices for goods, services, housing, and essentials rise, wages often increase only marginally or intermittently. The result is that even as people work the same or longer hours, their standard of living declines. Essentials that were once affordable now consume a larger portion of income, leaving less room for discretionary spending or savings. This lag between wages and costs is not accidental. Employers often use inflation as a reason to maintain wage growth below price increases, citing global competition, automation, or productivity challenges. Meanwhile, asset values, commodities, and investment returns may rise faster than salaries, creating an environment where wealth increasingly concentrates in ownership rather than labor. Over time, workers are forced to adjust their lifestyle, borrow to maintain living standards, or accept lower real purchasing power. Inflation acts like a slow-moving tax on labor, diminishing the tangible value of effort, skill, and time. Even diligent saving or prudent budgeting cannot fully offset the stealthy impact of rising prices. The disconnect between wages and the cost of living highlights the systemic nature of inflation as a tool that advantages asset holders and institutional borrowers while eroding the financial foundation of everyday workers. Government debt is eroded by higher prices. Inflation also benefits governments in subtle but significant ways. When prices rise, the real value of existing government debt declines. A loan taken out years ago for a fixed nominal amount becomes easier to repay in the future when inflation has reduced the purchasing power of money. In effect, inflation acts as a hidden mechanism for transferring wealth from taxpayers and savers to governments and debt holders. This phenomenon can incentivize governments to tolerate or even encourage moderate inflation. By doing so, they reduce the fiscal burden of debt repayments without raising taxes overtly. Citizens experience the cost of higher prices on a daily basis, while the government's debt burden shrinks quietly in the background. The erosion of debt through inflation can create long-term structural dependence on inflationary policies. Governments may rely on a constant, moderate rate of price increases to manage deficits, further institutionalizing a system where citizens' purchasing power is systematically reduced. Understanding this dynamic is crucial. Inflation is not just a market phenomenon. It is a strategic financial tool that redistributes wealth in ways that are largely invisible and long-lasting. Savings lose value over time. Perhaps the most personal impact of inflation is on savings. Money that sits idle in a bank account or in cash form steadily loses purchasing power as prices rise. $1,000 today will buy significantly less in 10 or 20 years if inflation continues unchecked. For ordinary savers, this is a silent form of wealth extraction because effort and frugality are gradually undermined by systemic forces beyond individual control. Even conservative investment strategies often struggle to keep pace with inflation. Low-yield accounts, government bonds, or fixed-income instruments frequently underperform relative to rising costs. While asset holders and speculative investors may see gains in real terms, those relying on cash-based savings are slowly losing value year after year. This invisible erosion reinforces systemic inequality. People with access to investments, real estate, stocks, or other assets can often hedge against inflation, while those without access experience its full negative impact. Wealth is not being destroyed, it is being redistributed quietly, favoring those who control capital rather than those who earn it through labor. Ultimately, inflation is not simply a side effect of economic policy. It is a mechanism, intentional or structurally inherent, that subtly transfers wealth, penalizes savers, and benefits institutions, governments, and borrowers at the expense of the average citizen. Recognizing this hidden process is the first step toward protecting your financial future. Everyday goods and services increase in price. Inflation shows up first and most visibly in the rising cost of everyday goods and services, from groceries and gasoline to healthcare and utilities. For most people, this is the part of inflation they feel first because it directly affects their daily lives. While salaries may stagnate, the cost of food, transportation, rent, and essential services continues to climb, quietly reducing disposable income and forcing households to make difficult choices. What was affordable last year becomes a luxury today, and this slow, incremental pressure often goes unnoticed until it significantly impacts living standards. The increase in prices is rarely uniform. Certain sectors, such as energy, housing, or healthcare, tend to rise faster than others. Because these are necessities rather than discretionary items, families feel the pinch even more. Inflation in these essential areas disproportionately affects lower and middle-income households, while wealthier individuals may offset rising costs with assets or investments that increase in value. This price growth is often amplified by supply chain issues, global market fluctuations, and corporate pricing strategies, but it is also structurally embedded in the system. The economy is designed so that a small, steady increase in prices maintains liquidity and encourages spending. While this is framed as economic stimulation, it is also a mechanism that erodes the real value of money for everyday people. Over time, the cumulative effect of rising prices on daily necessities acts like a hidden tax. People work harder, spend more, and save less, often without fully realizing that inflation is steadily reducing the real purchasing power of their income. It's subtle, continuous, and remarkably effective as a wealth transfer tool. Investments must outpace inflation to gain real wealth. For money to grow rather than simply maintain its value, investments must outperform inflation. Cash savings alone often fail to keep up with rising prices, meaning that without exposure to appreciating assets, wealth is slowly eroded. Stocks, real estate, commodities, and other investment vehicles are not just options, they have become necessities for protecting purchasing power and building real wealth over time. This requirement creates a significant structural advantage for those who already have capital. Individuals and institutions with the resources to invest can generate returns that outpace inflation, increasing their net worth and further concentrating wealth. Meanwhile, those without access to investment opportunities due to lower income, lack of financial education, or barriers to entry continue losing purchasing power despite working diligently. The need for inflation-beating investments also drives risk-taking behaviors. People are incentivized to move funds into speculative markets or leverage assets to achieve returns that simply preserve real value. While potentially profitable, these strategies carry risk and complexity, further highlighting the systemic inequality built into the way inflation operates. Ultimately, the gap between invested and uninvested wealth widens over time. Inflation is no longer just a gradual increase in prices, it becomes a driver of wealth stratification, favoring asset holders while penalizing those who rely solely on wages or cash savings. Understanding this dynamic is key to navigating financial stability in an inflationary system. Debtors benefit while creditors lose. Inflation is fundamentally a hidden transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors. When the value of money decreases over time, the real cost of repaying loans declines. For someone holding debt, whether a mortgage, student loan, or business loan, inflation reduces the burden in real terms, making repayment easier. In effect, borrowers pay back their debts with money that is worth less than when it was borrowed. Creditors, on the other hand, are disadvantaged. Money lent today loses purchasing power by the time it is repaid, reducing real returns. Interest rates may partially compensate for this, but when inflation is underestimated or rises unexpectedly, lenders often end up receiving less value than anticipated. This dynamic favors those who can borrow over those who provide capital. Governments also benefit from this mechanism. National debts and obligations can be eroded through inflation, subtly reducing fiscal pressure without requiring direct cuts to spending. Ordinary citizens holding savings or providing credit effectively subsidize these borrowers through diminished purchasing power. The transfer of wealth embedded in this process is slow, invisible, and widely misunderstood. It operates continuously, quietly shifting resources toward those who already have access to credit and away from those relying on financial assets or cash reserves. Over time, this becomes a structural advantage for borrowers at the systemic level. Prices rise disproportionately in essential sectors. Not all inflation affects goods and services equally. Essentials such as food, energy, healthcare, and housing often experience higher rates of price growth than luxury or discretionary items. Because these sectors are unavoidable in daily life, the impact falls heavily on households with fixed or modest incomes. Families must spend a larger share of their income just to maintain the same standard of living, while discretionary spending and savings are squeezed. This disproportionate rise in prices is partly market-driven, but also structurally reinforced. By ensuring that basic costs escalate faster than non-essentials, the system subtly pressures households to remain dependent on credit, government support, or asset-backed strategies. Inflation becomes not just a financial phenomenon, but a social mechanism that shapes lifestyle, consumption habits, and debt reliance. Moreover, rising costs in essential sectors ripple across the economy. Higher energy prices increase transportation and production costs, which are passed on to consumers. Rising healthcare costs force families to allocate more income to necessities, reducing discretionary spending that fuels economic diversity. The cycle reinforces the structural benefits to lenders, investors, and institutions that profit from inflationary pressures. Understanding this unequal impact highlights why inflation is not merely a neutral economic metric. It systematically extracts wealth from those least able to absorb rising costs, ensuring that the burden is felt most acutely by everyday people, while advantages accrue to asset holders and borrowers. Financial instruments are designed to offset inflation. Financial markets have developed instruments explicitly designed to protect investors from inflation. Treasury inflation-protected securities, inflation-indexed bonds, and commodities like gold provide hedges that preserve purchasing power. Similarly, real estate, stocks, and other tangible assets often appreciate faster than inflation, creating a buffer against its erosive effects. While these instruments protect wealth, they are not equally accessible to all. Ordinary savers, low-income households, and small-scale investors often lack the knowledge, capital, or opportunity to participate effectively. This structural asymmetry ensures that the financial elite, institutions, and governments can safeguard and grow their wealth, while the majority continue to experience purchasing power erosion. The very existence of these instruments underscores the intentional design embedded in the system. Inflation is expected and planned for, but protections are often reserved for those with access to capital markets. The result is a dual economy, one that can thrive amid rising prices and one that is slowly diminished by them. Investing, borrowing, and financial planning have become survival strategies in an environment where money naturally loses value over time. Understanding these tools and the inequalities surrounding them is essential for anyone seeking to navigate an inflationary system without falling victim to its subtle but powerful wealth transfers. Media narratives normalize price increases. One of the most subtle ways inflation steals value from everyday people is through the way it is presented by the media. Headlines about rising prices are often framed as expected, temporary, or market-driven, which normalizes the process and discourages public outrage. News cycles rarely contextualize inflation as a systemic wealth transfer mechanism, making it appear natural rather than engineered. People are conditioned to accept gradual cost increases as part of daily life, which reduces scrutiny of the policies, interest rates, or corporate strategies that may be contributing to the phenomenon. Media framing also emphasizes individual responsibility rather than systemic causes. Stories about price hikes often encourage consumers to budget better, shop smarter, or work longer hours, rather than questioning the structural forces driving inflation. By normalizing price increases, media narratives shape perception and behavior, subtly reinforcing the cycle of wealth transfer. Citizens are taught to accommodate rising costs rather than demand structural solutions, which ensures that the benefits of inflation accrue to those who can hedge or invest effectively. Furthermore, media narratives can amplify psychological effects. Fear of scarcity, rising costs, or missed opportunities drives consumer behavior, prompting quicker spending and borrowing. In this way, media coverage indirectly accelerates the redistribution of wealth from wage earners to asset holders and creditors. Over time, repeated exposure to these narratives conditions society to tolerate a steady erosion of purchasing power as an inevitable fact of life. The result is a population that accepts inflation quietly, often without understanding the hidden economic mechanisms at play. By framing price increases as normal, necessary, or unavoidable, media narratives play a critical role in ensuring that inflation functions as a subtle yet persistent tool for redistributing wealth. Corporate profits often rise faster than wages. While everyday prices climb, corporate profits frequently outpace wage growth. Companies pass higher production costs to consumers while simultaneously adjusting internal operations to maximize profit margins. This creates a scenario in which businesses benefit from inflation through pricing power, while employees struggle to maintain real income levels. Wages often lag behind essential costs, meaning that workers contribute disproportionately to rising profits simply by maintaining consumption. This dynamic reinforces systemic inequality. Asset owners and corporate executives can capitalize on inflation by raising prices, benefiting from investment growth, and leveraging debt advantages. Meanwhile, employees' earnings stagnate and their purchasing power declines. Over time, the gap between wealth derived from ownership and wealth derived from labor widens. Inflation allows corporations to obscure these shifts. Rising revenues are often celebrated as a sign of a thriving economy, even as workers face higher living costs and stagnant wages. Investors cheer record profits without acknowledging the underlying mechanisms that extract value from ordinary consumers. In essence, inflation acts as a silent partner in wealth concentration, channeling resources toward the top of the economic hierarchy. The imbalance between profit growth and wage growth is particularly pronounced in sectors producing essential goods and services. As prices increase, the cost burden falls most heavily on consumers with limited flexibility, reinforcing the systemic advantage enjoyed by corporate owners and investors. Tax brackets are not always inflation adjusted. Many tax systems fail to account for inflation adequately, which effectively increases the tax burden on citizens even if their real income remains constant. This phenomenon, often called bracket creep, occurs when nominal income rises due to inflation, but taxpayers are pushed into higher tax brackets, paying a larger percentage of their income to the government. The effect is a hidden, automatic tax on earnings that steadily erodes real income. Bracket creep disproportionately affects middle and lower income earners. Wealthy individuals often have access to sophisticated tax planning, deductions, and investment strategies that mitigate the effects of inflation on their taxable income. Meanwhile, ordinary workers experience the full impact, paying more without an actual increase in purchasing power. This hidden taxation amplifies the wealth transfer effects of inflation. While citizens earn more nominally, the combination of higher prices, stagnant wages, and increased taxation reduces disposable income. The government benefits from higher nominal tax revenue, debt burdens are easier to manage, and the systemic erosion of individual wealth continues quietly. Over time, the failure to adjust tax brackets creates persistent pressure on households, reducing their ability to save, invest, or maintain living standards. Inflation becomes not just a pricing problem, but a structural mechanism embedded in the tax system itself. The rich can hedge against inflation more easily. One of the most striking realities of inflation is that it affects different socioeconomic groups unequally. The wealthy can hedge against rising prices using financial tools such as stocks, real estate, inflation-protected bonds, commodities, and other sophisticated investment vehicles. Their portfolios are often structured to outpace inflation, turning rising prices into opportunities for wealth accumulation. Ordinary citizens, in contrast, rarely have access to these hedging strategies. Savings accounts, fixed income investments, or cash holdings typically lose value over time, leaving those without investment access increasingly vulnerable. Inflation, therefore, becomes a structural advantage for the rich, while it erodes the purchasing power of the majority. It simultaneously enhances the wealth of those who can protect or leverage their assets. This disparity reinforces systemic inequality. Inflation is not an equalizer, it is a mechanism that redistributes wealth upward. It benefits those who control capital while undermining those whose primary resources are wages or cash savings. The result is a widening gap between asset holders and ordinary earners, where the economic system rewards ownership and punishes labor. The ability of the wealthy to hedge effectively also influences political and economic policy. Those with influence can shape regulations, investment incentives, and monetary strategies to favor asset growth, ensuring that inflation continues to serve as a mechanism that transfers wealth subtly yet powerfully within the system. Everyday purchasers pay the hidden cost. Ultimately, the most direct victims of inflation are the everyday purchasers, the people who buy groceries, pay rent, commute to work, and manage household budgets. Each incremental price increase chips away at their real income, reduces discretionary spending, and erodes savings. The cost is often invisible at first, but over months and years, it accumulates into a significant financial burden. Unlike borrowers, corporations, or investors, everyday purchasers cannot leverage inflation to their advantage. They experience it passively, as a constant drain on their financial resources. Necessities such as food, energy, healthcare, and housing absorb a growing share of income, leaving less room for discretionary spending or long-term planning. The hidden cost is further compounded by systemic mechanisms such as interest rate manipulation, stagnant wages, bracket creep, and uneven investment access. Each of these factors interacts with rising prices to reduce the real value of ordinary earnings, creating a multi-layered wealth transfer from the majority to those with capital. Influence, or access to financial tools. Understanding that inflation is not neutral, that it is a systemically engineered redistribution of wealth, empowers individuals to take action, whether through strategic investment, political awareness, or lifestyle adjustments. For everyday purchasers, awareness is the first step toward mitigating the silent erosion of purchasing power that occurs with each passing month. If this video helped you see how inflation quietly steals value and shifts wealth, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth insights into the systems that affect your money and your future. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you noticed the impact of rising costs in your own life? Like this video if it opened your eyes, and share it with friends, family, and colleagues so more people understand how everyday inflation works against them. Knowledge is the first step to action, and together we can start reclaiming control over the money that belongs to us.